Welcome to session 2 of Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services. Today we have with us Dr. Deepak Jayarajan, who is Associate Professor of Psychiatry in Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services, NIMANS, Bangalore. Today he will take us through National Trust Act and Rights of Persons with Disability Act. We welcome you, sir.
We're going to basically go through the following outline. We're going to briefly discuss how a psychiatrist is connected to laws and rehabilitation, why knowing these makes some sense. We're going to look at some provisions under the National Trust Act 1999 that are relevant and some provisions under the RPWD Act 2016 which are relevant. We won't be able to cover both of these acts in their entirety because they're quite long acts, and I would encourage you to go back and read them after this session, but we'll go through the major highlights. And lastly, we'll end with some parting thoughts and questions that you can think about and that you can discuss after the didactic. So, what role does the psychiatrist have in rehabilitation, and what role are they given in terms of various laws? So, we know that psychiatrists have a role in both assessment of patients as well as are part of the medical board and the certifying authorities that are mandated under the RPWD and the acts and the National Trust Act. There are very often patients may require information about welfare measures which psychiatrists are in a good position to give if they know about them, of course. Access to treatment is something that causes patients to drop out of care or stop following up or actually have a worsening of symptoms. And so some of these laws and some of these schemes actually help patients with access to treatment. And therefore it's important for the psychiatrist to know more of these things. Often, for some patients who are severely ill, families may need support in terms of planning for the future. The person with disability themselves may need some help in terms of planning for the future. And so some knowledge of these laws helps the psychiatrist be a good support system, or at least helps them access care from the places that they would be best, that are best equipped to help them. Patient rights. So we know that sometimes patients may face discrimination. What rights do they have? This could be during employment, this could be in the community, this could be at home. What are the remedies available to them, and how can we help them seek these? And lastly, we know that community-based rehabilitation is something that is increasingly a larger need and is something that laws and various policies mandate us to do. And so, as part of community-based rehabilitation, knowing the supports that are available through these laws becomes important. So some of the acts that you should probably read. There's the Rehabilitation Council of India Act in 1992, the Persons with Disability Act in 1995, the National Trust Act in 1999, the Rights of Persons with Disability Act, and the Mental Health Care Act. There are also various rules based on these acts. The National Trust Act had rules in 2000, the RPWD Act rules were in 2017, the central rules, and there are also specific state rules for these. So I would urge you to go back and read some of these so that you get a better understanding and context of what we're going to do. The full form is the National Trust for the Welfare of Persons with Multiple Disabilities Act of 19. This includes 4 primary disabilities, and this was enacted in 1999, and it covers these 4 disabilities. Now, where do the definitions of multiple disability, autism, intellectual disability, and cerebral palsy derive from? They originally derived from the PWD Act, or the Persons with Disability Act, and now from the RPWD Act. In the RPWD Act, persons with multiple disability are defined as persons having more than one disability from the list of 21 disabilities that are scheduled under the Act. So this is important to remember. Multiple disability does not include only people with that. It doesn't mean that somebody with autism, intellectual disability, or cerebral palsy as one of the multiple disabilities can only come under this Act. It actually covers everybody with multiple disability. So the Act itself, it has 9 chapters. These include definitions, the composition of the board of the National Trust, the objectives of the trust, powers and duties of the board, procedure for registration, local level committees, accountability and monitoring, finance, accounts and audit, and miscellaneous section. We won't be covering all of them. We'll probably cover the highlights, since the same document, which is available from the National Trust website, also indicates the rules that were formed under the National Trust Act in 2000. And some of these add on to the tenets of the National Trust Act, some schemes the National Trust that are probably of relevance to you for at least 4 hours or more between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. And these, it looks at 8 specific: or early intervention therapist, physiotherapist or occupational therapist, and caregivers and ayahs part of this scheme. The daycare scheme looks at enhancing interpersonal and vocational skills, and it covers those in the higher age groups. Again, it needs at least 6 hours per day between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. and at least 21 days in a month. The Samarth or respite care looks at respite home for orphans or persons who are abandoned from lower income groups. So the Samarth home is basically intended for respite care for families. And this could be important when you're dealing with somebody with a developmental disorder or somebody with multiple disability. For adults, and it looks at assuring a minimum quality of care and the assured home for persons throughout life. Vocational activities center, the batch, and it should be on a basis of 1:1, which is basically an indication that the scheme envisions that there will be some paid seats in this center, and this will help ensure the center's sustainability over time. And one scheme which is particularly important for all of you would be the Niramaya Health Insurance Scheme. And the fee would be around 250 for people below the poverty line and 500 per annum for those above the poverty line. Now, it's important to remember that some states actually take on the burden of paying this fee. So in some states, it's entirely free for those below the poverty line. And this scheme can be availed with treatment in any hospital. However, this is not cash free or cashless. This is reimbursable after the person takes treatment. And it's important to remember that the reimbursement would mean that the person should submit their bills within a month of incurring them. And this is an important thing that you must keep in mind when advising somebody about applying for reimbursement under the scheme. It carries an overall limit of 1 lakh rupees in a year. The overall limit for inpatient hospitalization is 70,000 rupees. There is a limit for outpatient treatment, which is around 14,500 rupees, of which 8,000 is dedicated for OPD-based care, which includes diagnostic care, tests and medication. There is some amount allotted for ongoing therapies. This is primarily for those with other types of disabilities or physical disabilities. There is some element for alternative medicine, and people can reimburse transportation costs which are incurred when traveling to avail these facilities, up to rupees 1,000. So again, this scheme can be of great help to people who come under the National Trust Act. It doesn't apply to all disabilities, and the overall limit per person is around 1 lakh. But every time reimbursement is sought, it must be sought within a month of incurring the bills. There are other schemes, including a caregiver training scheme, the Sahyogi, the Gyan Prabha, the educational support scheme, the Prerna, marketing assistance for people under the National Trust Act, the Sambhav scheme about AIDS and assisted devices, and the Batte Kadam, which looks at awareness and community interaction. Now, you might ask who actually executes these schemes. Now, these are registered organizations which are registered with the National Trust, and they must show criteria such as, having run for some time, having audited accounts, experience, after which they are registered under the National Trust. This eligibility of these organizations is listed in the Act and the rules. So I would encourage you to read them. Now, under this trust, some things that you'll have to remember is that there's a state nodal agency center. And this nodal agency will actually contain the details of all of the other centers which are registered with the National Trust in their state. So this is a valuable resource for somebody in your own state. If you are referring somebody from your state back to their own home state, this is actually searchable online. So you can actually look at the National Trust website, detect which is the state nodal agency center in the area, and actually get people to go and avail these services. There are also state level coordination committees, which are primarily administrative, and importantly, the local level committee. The local level committee allocates guardianship. And so there will be legal guardians who come under this local level committee. The registered organizations, as we discussed, are those registered with the National Trust Act, and they actually perform all of these activities. The state nodal agency center is one of these registered organizations with the National Trust that the center or the state deems, the state deems is reliable and is able to serve as a state nodal agency center. Coming to guardianship under Section 14. Now, the local level committee allots guardianship. So it must first look at the need for guardianship and the purposes for which guardianship is sought. And while allotting guardianship, the local level committee has the freedom to provide obligations of the guardian. It also, after the guardianship is approved, within 6 months, there must be an inventory of immovable property, all assets and other movable property which is received on behalf of the person with disability, which the guardian submits to the local level committee. And every year, within 3 months of the close of each financial year, there must be an account of property and assets submitted to the National Trust. So the rules about guardianship, which are specified in the rules for the National Trust, the person must be a citizen of India. The guardian we're talking about. The guardian must also not be of unsound mind or currently undergoing treatment for mental illness. The guardian must have no history of criminal conviction, must not be a destitute or homeless and dependent on others for his or her own living, and not been declared insolvent or bankrupt. There are some additional things that you might want to know. For example, guardianship over somebody who is not a citizen of India can't be granted by the local level committees. Similarly, however, some things like suppose the person with disability owns assets which is outside of the district where this local level committee is based. The local level committee and the guardian would still have jurisdiction over accounts, etc., for this property that is under the person with disability. So the rules about guardianship, why are they framed this way? Primarily because the local level committee has an area of jurisdiction beyond which it can't enforce any laws, or beyond which if a guardian exists beyond these boundaries, then the local level committee has no power to allot guardianship. Hence, if somebody is not a citizen of India, the rules also go on to state that if somebody is out of country or who's living outside the country but is an Indian citizen, they would still not be given guardianship because the local level committee cannot assure jurisdiction. So that's something to remember, that's something families might want to know. Why should you talk about guardianship? Should guardianship be for everybody? The advice from the National Trust is that guardianship is a useful tool, but many times you may have to actually help people understand why you're talking about guardianship before they want to actually do so. So one would be to access social benefits. I'm not sure if you're aware, but many schemes, including pension transfer from parents for government pension holders, require that the pension be given only if a guardian is able to receive this. This applies to all types of disabilities other than those with physical disabilities because of the way the pension rules are framed. Now, essentially, without guardianship, the person might actually not receive the pension which they are due. So, somebody may want to apply for guardianship under the National Trust Act. The RPWD has itself now begun to guardianship provisions are under the RPWD. We'll discuss that a little bit later. The guardianship actually, for example, in Bangalore and Karnataka, Bangalore, there were very few guardianships. Considering the number of people who come under the National Trust Act, there are very few guardians who apply each year. So again, understanding and access may be an issue. Again, when there is high support needs or high support benefits, which are some provisions that the government may make access for, they again would require a guardian to help the person access benefits. And oftentimes, it's important to think about guardianship much before there is a need for guardianship, or rather, especially under the National Trust Act, when we're talking about people with developmental disabilities, this might be an important factor to consider. So guardianship is an important tool and resource, but if you want to tell people about applying for guardianship, you'll have to give them some degree of a background as to why it would be important for them. Some resources that you can go to. This is the National Trust website. The second link is the one that actually takes you to finding an organization which is based in a particular state. And the last one talks about a guardianship application, which looks something like the image to the upper right of your screen. So it is online now, and there you can see that it asks for personal details, attachments which are relevant to the person with disability, and the guardian details and the applicant details, and so forth. So usually people are informed about the local level committee meeting by email or by phone as their preferred method of contact. Now, the local level committee ideally should meet around 4 times a year at least, but this doesn't always happen. So this is in short about some schemes and some measures under the National Trust Act. Coming to the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016. This is an evolution of law from the Persons with Disability Act 1995. Why was it passed? Well, India ratified the United Nations Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities in 2007. And the RPWD is an important step in bringing our laws in line with this commitment. And so some of the principles that are enshrined in the UNCRPD and which the RPWD aims to uphold are respect for dignity and individual autonomy, non-discrimination, full participation in community, respect and acceptance of the person, equality of opportunity between men and women, accessibility to all services for persons with disability, and a respect for the rights and the capacities of children as they evolve over their lifespan. So the chapters themselves, we will not be going through all of them in detail, but it includes a preliminary section which gives some very important definitions. Section 2 talks about protections from various or other rights and entitlements, which include very specific provisions for the protection of people with disability. There are educational, skill development and employment provisions, and social security, health, rehabilitation and recreation. Chapter 6 looks at special provisions for people with benchmark disabilities. We'll come to that in a second. And section 7 looks at disabilities for persons with disabilities with high support needs. 8 talks about the duties and responsibility of appropriate governments. 9 about the registration of institutions and grants to such institution. 10 talks about the certification of specified disability. That's something we'll talk about today. And the 11th section talks about central and state advisory boards on disability and the district level committees. Section 12 talks about the chief commissioner and state commissioner. Section 13, a special court. Section 14, a national fund. And section 15, a state fund. And section 6 section 16 and 17 talk about offenses and penalties and some miscellaneous provisions. Now, it's important to remember that some differences from the Persons with Disabilities Act is that from 7 disabilities, the list has been expanded to 21. And they include blindness, low vision, leprosy cured, hearing impairment, locomotor disability, dwarfism, speech and language disability, muscular dystrophy, and acid attack victims. Leprosy cured, locomotor disability, dwarfism, muscular dystrophy, and acid attack victims all come under locomotor disability. In addition, there are intellectual disability, mental illness, specific learning disabilities, autism, cerebral palsy, and these are the disabilities in which a psychiatrist has a role in terms of helping them access the provisions of these laws. You also have chronic neurological conditions, and this includes multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease, blood disorders like thalassemia, hemophilia, and sickle cell disease, and lastly, multiple disabilities, which we just discussed. I'm not going to go through each definition of each disability. I hope that you will do that. It is given in the RPWD Act in the addendum or in the appendix. But some important definitions that you should know. A person with disability is a person with long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment, which in interaction with societal and environmental barriers hinders the person's full and effective participation in society equally with others. Now keep in mind that person with disability does not refer to somebody with more than a specific amount of disability or more than a specific percentage of disability. And if you look at the new concept of what disability means, and that anybody could be disabled and there is a spectrum, person with disability actually refers to people with even below benchmark disability. So almost anybody with a with an illness could be come under the term person with disability, and that has some implications which we'll discuss later. Another important definition is person with benchmark disability. This is a person with not less than 40% of a specified disability, either where it is estimated where there's no clear measurement, an estimation that is more than 40%, or a percentage score more than 40%, where there's a clear way to assess this disability. There's also a person with disability having high support needs, and this is basically means a person with benchmark disability who is certified under clause A of subsection 2 of section 58 that they need high support. What does high support mean? It means that this person may require an intensive support, which could be physical, psychological, and otherwise, and it is required for their daily activities to take independent and informed decisions, to access facilities, and in terms of participating in all areas of life, which include important domains such as education, employment, family, community life, treatment, and therapy. So high support needs are an important aspect of what some people will need. There is a gazette which has come out about the assessment for high support needs. Again, I would go back, I'm not covering it today in great detail. I would encourage you to go back and look at that gazette. However, it's important to keep in mind that many of the schemes for people with high support needs have not yet been detailed by states or by central government. So this assessment of, or rather the provisions for high support needs are some things that we expect will happen over a period of time. So one thing is that you'll have to be open to be updating yourself about some of these provisions over time. Reasonable accommodation. This looks at necessary and appropriate modification and adjustments without imposing a disproportionate or undue burden in particular cases to the employer, to ensure that persons with disabilities can have their rights equally or exercise their rights equally. And in work, it becomes an important thing where the employer is expected to provide reasonable accommodation before taking any action toward against a person with disability, or before looking at terminating or in any way challenging the person's current position. Rehabilitation is defined as a process aimed at helping people with disabilities attain and maintain optimal physical, sensory, intellectual, psychological, environmental, or social functioning levels. So those are some important definitions that you should keep in mind. So the various rights and entitlements talk about equality and non-discrimination, the right to live in the community, protection from cruelty and inhuman treatment, which includes permissions for research on people with disability, for which a committee for research on disability should be set up in each state. There should be protection from abuse, violence, and exploitation, and the person should be able to have support arrangements which will help them live in the community and which would safeguard them from these provisions. And the onus for all of these is placed on the government. Protection and safety, living with home and family, reproductive rights, and this includes the right not to be sterilized or not to have anatomical sterilization just because the person has disability. So it means that the person with disability for any kind of procedure of the same must be able to give consent. There is also a provision of accessibility for voting, access to justice, which is supposed to be provided by the national and state legal services authorities, and there should be legal capacity on an equal basis for property, for support to the person with disability. Guardianship under the RPWD Act. Now here it is under either district court or designated authority. Now each state has framed rules for the RPWD. Some states are still to frame these rules. So each of them will have a guardianship committee. It will be located at this particular place. All guardianships under the RPWD which are granted will be limited guardianship. What does limited guardianship mean? It means it's a system of joint decision making. It operates on mutual understanding and trust between the person with disability and the guardian. It's limited in particular ways. It's limited to a specific period, for a specific decision, and for a specific situation. And it should operate in accordance with the will of the person with disability. So this can be challenged by the person with disability themselves. There is a provision for something that the RPW Act calls total support. And this seems to be for people who are unable to cooperate with the guardian in a meaningful way, or other people who do not have the capacity to take any of these decisions at all. Now, this provision for total support is not enshrined in all state rules. So it's something that you should keep in mind. So you should read both the RPWD and your state rules from the state that you are in. It also talks about designation of certain authorities to support persons with disabilities. Coming to education, skill development, and employment. Now it talks about both inclusive education, which basically means that study or they are part of it. So they should not be segregated from the rest of their peers. It also looks at improving accessibility and specific schemes and programs. Now, it's important to remember this key thing about non-discrimination in employment or the equal opportunity policy. Now, government establishments, private establishments with more than 20 employees, and are supposed to actually follow these non-discrimination rules. The Act itself talks about non-discrimination in government establishments. The rules actually go beyond that to talk about both government establishments and private establishments. Any complaints can be submitted to the employer, and if the employer does not act or the person with disability so wishes, complaints can be given to the Chief Commissioner for Disability in that state. And the Chief Commissioner for Disability is supposed to dispose of the complaint within 60 days. In cases which are deemed necessary, this should be done within 30 days. And the law also looks at, we talked about reasonable accommodation before. So reasonable accommodation in the workplace, an appropriate barrier-free environment, and a conducive environment is mandated. So some provisions under the PWD which continue are about, say for example, not having a person with disability lose their job because they have developed disability. So they are supposed to be provided a supernumerist or an alternate set of, rather they are supposed to be provided an alternate set of duties at the same salary level, should not be passed over for promotion, or they can be given a supernumerary position in the establishment. Similarly, there are some protections for caregivers also, such as not being asked to, such as those in a transferable job, applying to not be transferred if they have a dependent with disability. So it's good to know some of these schemes in mind, because these can make a big difference to quality of life. This equal opportunity policy is something that actually all organizations are supposed to put out. And it should include what the facilities and amenities are for persons with disability. This is for all establishments. For government establishments and private establishments with more than 20 employees, these must go beyond that and talk about how people are selected, which types of jobs have been set aside for those with disability, and what are the available mechanisms to look at grievances and apply for help. It's important for all employers to maintain records, and there should be an appointments of grievance redressal officer in all government establishments. These records which are maintained are actually also supposed to be available to what is called the Special Employment Exchange. And we'll come up about that shortly. Coming to social security, health and recreation. So the onus is on the government to provide these schemes. Some schemes detailed on the Act are community centers with good living conditions, facilities for persons without other support, including people who are homeless, people who are abandoned, people who are orphaned, support to women with disability, specifically support during disasters and access to water and sanitation, aids and appliances, and some of the social security measures mentioned in the RPWD are disability pension, which is determined by the state, the caregiver allowance. This is for those with high support needs. Please keep in mind that the caregiver allowance is for persons with benchmark disability for high support needs. So all of these apply to people with benchmark disability, but caregiver allowances for people with high support needs. Unemployment allowance, if somebody is on the special employment exchange for more than 2 years without receiving employment, they will get a unemployment allowance and comprehensive insurance. Healthcare, some of the things that the Act envisions are, it should be free, subject, however, to family income that the state and the central government deem. It should be accessible, barrier-free, and people should get healthcare on a priority basis if they have disability. Services and programs of rehabilitation should be put forth by the government, including health, education, and employment. And efforts to include people in cultural life, recreational activities, and sport should be taken up. Coming to certain specific things that you should remember. So there is supposed to be free education with people with benchmark disability or children with benchmark disabilities from the age of 6 to 18 years of age. There's a 5% reservation in government and government-aided educational institutions, and there is an upper age relaxation of 5 years for admission. In addition, people with disabilities during their education are entitled to certain provisions. These are things like in an exam, they may have a scribe, they may be able to take 20 minutes extra per 1 hour allotted to them, and these kinds of reservation or these kinds of benefits are actually applicable to everybody with disability. And this is as per a government gazette. So it's important that you both have the gazette and are able to tell people that they can ask for these things. Coming to employment, 4% or at least 4% of the total number of vacancies in the cadre strength in each group of posts need to be reserved for people with disability. And this is different from the previous PWD Act, where the number was different, 3%. So here, it's important to remember that 1% of these posts are for those with blindness or low vision, 1% for those who are deaf or hard of hearing, 1% for those with locomotor disability, and this includes people with cerebral. This includes people with who are acid attack victims, dwarfism, leprosy cured, etc. Now, it's important to remember that the last 1% is reserved for two categories. That is, it's reserved for people with autism, intellectual disability, specific learning disability, and mental illness, and people with multiple disability. So this 1% is actually divided among all of these various disabilities. So please keep this in mind again when you're talking about reservations. Please remember that these reservations which are mandated are for government posts or government employment. And there is also supposed to be a relaxation of upper age limit for employment. The law also looks at providing incentives to employers in private sectors to at least ensure that 5% of the workforce has persons with disability. There is a special employment exchange which will keep records of posts available for people with disability and a record of which people with disability are looking for jobs. And there should be a 5% reservation with priority to women for allotment of agricultural land and housing, poverty alleviation schemes, allotment of land at a concessional rate for housing, shelter, and the setting up of occupations like businesses, enterprises, recreation centers, and production centers. So these are some of the provisions for people with disability in terms of employment, in terms of education. Coming to certification, any person with a specified disability may apply in Form 4, given in the rules and in that are for people for the guidelines for certification for disability. And they need to submit the application to a medical authority or any other notified competent authority in their district, or the concerned medical authority in a government hospital where this person may have been undergoing or may have undergone treatment in connection with the disability. Please keep this in mind. Both of these are actually valid as per the Rights of Persons with Disability Act. Where can you find guidelines for certification? You can look at, there is the Chief Commissioner for Disabilities website, which is the lower link on your screen. However, it sometimes is not working in the recent past effectively. The other place that you can find these guidelines is in the disabilityaffairs.gov.in website, which is for the Department of Persons with Disability, for empowerment of persons with disability. So there's a medical authority role, and their role is that they should issue the certificate of disability within a month from the date of receipt of application. If not eligible, that also has to be informed to the person with disability in a specific form. Now, from now on, all of these are valid throughout the country. And it can either be a permanent disability certificate or a certificate with a period of validity, with how long this is valid. The documentation mentioned is a proof of residence, 2 recent passport size photographs, and an Aadhaar number or Aadhaar enrollment number, though this is not mandatory. If the person provides an Aadhaar number or a Aadhaar enrollment number, they do not need to provide proof of residence separately. What are the various forms? Forms of 1 to 3 are for forms for PWD employees' returns under Section 13. Form 4 is about the application for obtaining a certificate of disability from a PWD. This is under Rule 17 of the RPWD Central Rules. And Form 4 talks about certificate of disability in case of amputation, paralysis of limbs, dwarfism, and blindness. And Form 6 is about those with multiple disability. Form 7 is for other forms and in forms 5 and 6, any other disabilities it can be in Form 7. Form 8 is about rejection for reasons for why this person with disabilities application was not deemed worthy or not deemed eligible for guardianship. Not deemed eligible for certification of disability. Please keep in mind that the certification here that we're talking about is not a certification of disability more than it is a certification of benchmark disability. So there are various broad categories under which various boards are set up under the rules for the RPWD. So there are boards for locomotor disability, for visual impairment, for hearing impairment, as well as speech and language disability, intellectual disability, specific learning disability, autism spectrum disorder, for which separate gazette and guidelines have been given, mental illness, disability caused due to chronic neurological conditions, including multiple sclerosis and Parkinsonism, and a disability due to blood disorder. Excuse me. Lastly, a disability due to multiple disabilities may include a board which will call upon various experts. So this is something that you should look at. It is the UDID or the swavlumbncard.gov.in website. Excuse me. This looks at what we call the unique disability ID. Now this is basically a method of allowing people to apply for disability benefits online. And it envisions a unique disability ID which can apply across a gamut of services, so that the person with disability does not need to keep applying to different services for their rights. However, this is still in the stage where it is still being enrolled across the country. Keep in mind that in the states in which the unique disability ID is given, the other avenues for being certified for disability would not be working. So where the unique disability ID is initiated, usually you'll find that you need to know about this website, you need to know about how certification is done, so you can help people apply for certification under this scheme. So there are various types of UDID applications. One is to digitize and verify an old certificate issued under the PWD Act or the RPWD Act, and these still continue to be valid. It could be a new application for disability assessment and certification, or it could be an appeal against an earlier medical authority assessment report. So you can look at the individual applicant site. This is what the login looks like under the swavlumbncard.gov.in. So once you log in, you must understand that the state of the project so far is that it started in 10 states and union territories, and another 26 it's now initiated. This is a little old information, but in the state of Karnataka, we found around 16,268 applications as in 8th August. However, there have been more which have happened over the last few months. It has the estimates of disability from the people enrolling is around 1 million against an estimated 1.32 million as per the census for 2011. So we do need to enroll more people into this scheme, and the medical authorities can sort out application based on type of disability, name, enrollment numbers, date of application. What you need to remember about this, which I'll only talk very briefly about, is that the certification of disability is such that somebody gives an application, As it stands currently, the person's application goes to the district where they are from, which is given as part of their address. And so this would mean that we talked about a provision in the RPWD Act where somebody could either apply in their district or in the hospital for which they were seeking treatment from. Now this second, or this B method of applying for a disability certificate is not possible through the UDID platform at present. However, we hope that this functionality will come up in time. As it stands currently, once somebody applies for disability, their applications would go into a common pool in particular districts, and hospitals with this particular board available, when they would log on every day, they would look for applicants and choose applicants who would be certified by them. Once this board is chosen, the person will get a intimation by SMS or by email that they are supposed to come to this particular board for assessment of disability. So that is how the project works right now. In your state, it may be in a different phase. It may already be working well. So that is something that you should keep in mind. There are some places where you can get some videos about this. It's available now on sovereigncard.gov.in. It's available. There's some YouTube videos about how to apply and how to generate UDID and how to verify and upload an application and process it. Now the challenges are how to adhere to the 1 month time frame, because that is provided by the Government of India. There is an onus of checking details like name spelling, whether the photo is recent or not, whether the address uploaded matches with the residence proof document by the medical board personnel. Practical implementation challenges relate to availability of specialist doctors, board members on a date when appointment is fixed, and assessment in hospital where one has been treated versus one's district, like as we just talked about. So lastly, some parting thoughts that you should think about. Now, where would you apply for guardianship? Would it be the designated authority or the local level committee? As it stands right now, the RPWD has superseded all other authorities for guardianship. And so this would mean that they would have the primary power of allotting guardianship. However, in many states, local level committees continue to give guardianships. Right now, as it stands, the state has some states have not taken a stand that local level committees should be stopped. So both seem to exist as of now, though as per legal standards, the RPWD Act is supreme. It's important to think about some of these things that we've discussed today, as some welfare measures require a guardian. For example, we discussed that pension transfers or a family pension would be transferred only if somebody had a guardian or a nominee. And one thing we must think about is that when we make such rules, such as the requirement for a guardian to avail of a pension, is that itself discriminatory. For example, suppose somebody with disability were to go to a board, and the board would deem that this person was capable of handling their own affairs, has the capacity to handle their own affairs, then the person may never actually get the pension which is due to them, simply because the requirement for a guardian is there. So those are some things that the rules need to change over time. Will the UDID allow certification in hospitals where the PWD is treated? This requires some change to the software platform, and this hopefully will happen over time. And education about such benefits requires some knowledge on the part of the psychiatrists themselves. This is important because you might have to guide the patient to team members. Many times the patient may meet you and not meet the person who can help them achieve these things. And it would be important to look at when somebody would need to be referred to a legal aid cell, either the state or the national level, when they would need to help with applying for a UDID or applying for online for guardianship. These are some things that you need to keep in mind. Some things that you must read. You should read the RPWD Act. You should read both the central and the rules that are drafted by your state. You should read the National Trust Act as well, and some things about the schemes. You should look up the UDID and look at how it is implemented in your states. And you should look at certification guidelines, including the ideal site would be the Chief Commissioner for Disability website. However, since it's not functioning on some occasions, it could be the Department of Empowerment of Persons with Disability that you look at. Please keep in mind that when you certify, I understand that you have a class in the future about which will take this up in more detail, but there are some specific rules in the certification guidelines that you should keep in mind. For example, if somebody has both intellectual disability and mental illness, there is you would think of certifying them for multiple disability. Now they can be certified for multiple disability, but the formula that is used to calculate the disability that is due to multiple disability, where you combine two scores, is not applicable to persons with both mental illness and intellectual disability. In that case, you must actually apply the greater disability score from between the two. So you don't combine scores in that instance, in that particular instance. However, in every other instance, you can combine the disability scores. Also keep in mind that there are some complications, like the assessment for SLD has limits to which age standards exist. In addition, the NIMHANS battery for SLD, which is the approved way to certify disability under the certification guidelines, does not give you a percentage scores. It only says whether somebody is more than 40% or not. Okay, so you must keep these things in mind when you are certifying somebody for disability. I would urge you to go back and read these things. And there are some FAQs about guardianship, about what after me for persons with intellectual disability, that are available on our website. And you can actually visit our website and take a look at them. It may help you in terms of reading about these things in a short way. But please keep in mind that your state might be a little bit different, or the measures might be different, especially if you're not from Karnataka. If some of these, I think, are on our new site, may not be very easily accessible. If you want them, I suppose we can mail them to you as part of this. Some of our pamphlets and FAQs are a little dated. They are yet to be updated soon, keeping in mind the UDID and other things, but they can serve as a way at least to look at other measures. So with that, I think we'll go to questions, and I can take some of your questions on what we've just discussed. Has been a little bit about when certification and recertification must be done. So you should keep that in mind for when you are trying to look at when somebody should be called for a recertification. You should look at those things. The question that was asked was reimbursement under the RPWD scheme. Now reimbursement, currently there was a scheme called the Swavalamban scheme, which looked at a floater scheme for persons with disability and their families. This scheme is no longer running. It was running for a brief period of time, but over the last few months has stopped being run. And it looks like things may come under the Ayushman Bharat ambit of schemes per se. So a lot of these measures will be provided under that. However, the one difficulty with the Ayushman Bharat is that it does not address OPD-based care. One of the few insurance schemes to do so is the Niramaya Health Insurance Scheme. So we still have to wait for insurance schemes to come out. At the moment, right now, how it works is that it works as per the inpatient care is under the Ayushman Bharat, or other schemes may take care. But this is some scheme that still has to be come out or has to be revamped.
Previously, mental illness was not covered under any insurances. So usually there would be exclusion criteria, and one of the exclusion criteria would be mental illness. So this also happens because of a concept called as risk pooling. Now, how insurance work is that if everybody applies for an insurance and very few people actually get that illness and then go and get admitted, so that gets reimbursed. Not everybody would probably get an illness and get admitted. Now, whereas if we see mental illness and such kind of illnesses, which are probably require long-term care and long-term treatment, so the insurance companies would have to pay every time the person gets ill. And because of this reason, mental illness was not included or was an exclusion criteria for many private and even government insurances. Now, recently, about 2 years ago or so, there was from Insurance Authority, IRDAI, there was a notification telling after RPWD Act, all insurances will have to take up mental health also. They can't exclude mental illness just because it would be discriminatory. So according to RPWD Act, all disabilities, including mental illness as a disability, should be taken up for insurances. Notification has come out. After this notification has come out, some of the health insurances, at least in private sector, have taken away mental illness as an exclusion criteria, and people now can avail these health insurances also. As Dr. Deepak sir was pointing out, the other government health insurance schemes also have taken away the exclusion of mental illness, like ESI or even Ayushman Bharat. So there it is already included, and that's the reason probably why Swavlamban, which was a exclusive health insurance coverage for persons with disability, is taken away.
One more thing that I think you should keep in mind and you must understand is that there are two concepts of what is insurance and what is healthcare. So, say for example, insurance primarily is in some ways a gamble against the future, which is where this concept of pools come in. That is, you pay a company a certain amount of money so that you say that in the event of a future event happening, you will pay me money. So, if this event is more likely, then your premiums become higher because the payouts will become more. If the event is less likely to occur, the premium will be lower because that event will less payouts will occur. Now, it's important to remember that insurance is a for-profit, and in certain countries like the USA, insurance is the primary way in which basic healthcare is also delivered. Now, in many countries with more socialized medicine, insurance is not the vehicle by which basic care is developed. Insurance is done for things like life insurance and things which are about future events, which could be homeowners insurance, car insurance, where a future event can be protected against. However, basic healthcare is delivered by basic healthcare services. So our country, one of the reasons why the Ayushman Bharat was brought up was because a large number of people access care through private medical services and not through publicly funded medical services. And because of that, there is a large out-of-pocket expenditure. And the Ayushman Bharat is a way to look at reimbursing people for such an expenditure, even if they have to take it in a private setup, given that there may be barriers to access. However, over time, if you're looking at deliverance of basic care, it's important to keep in mind that insurance and the type of insurance that some companies, like in the United States of America, insurance includes both basic care and against hedge against future risk. So it's important to keep this in mind when you think about what insurance is. And as Dr. Chetan pointed out, insurance is something that should be given by all companies. Some of them have been a little late in providing these schemes. So with time, hopefully it should happen. But you should be on the lookout in your state. You should know about some details of the Ayushman Bharat, especially for people who require it. The Ayushman Bharat is a scheme for those who come under the socioeconomic census of 2011. So basically, those who came below a certain level, there is a site to which you can actually go look at your Aadhaar card and or an Aadhaar number, and through that understand whether you are covered or not. Now there is a card that very often there's a smart card which is being issued, and certain states have combined it with their own insurance schemes, like in Karnataka, where there's a scheme called the Arogya Karnataka, and those provisions and the Ayushman Bharat have been combined into one. So please keep these things in mind about insurance. Sometimes when somebody from another state visits, it may not be enough to only have basic documentation. In those cases, they may require that Swavlamban card itself be shown. In the same state, it is actually not necessary to have that card made at all. So again, these are some things that you will have to look at or read up about, because it can vary from state to state.
One can also probably look at some of the articles which the team from PRS has written on both Niramaya Health Scheme in Indian Journal of Pediatric Health, and also on out-of-pocket expenditure and how insurance and reimbursement will actually happen in IJPM and Asian Journal of Psychiatry. So apart from that, Dr. Bharti, you have a question. Can you please unmute your mic and ask the question?
Sir, good evening, sir. What kind of benefits that a person with acute psychosis on remission, and as well as a schizophrenic patient on remission, sir? or any bipolar patient on remission?
Mhm. I think you're asking an interesting question about, do you certify somebody with acute psychosis versus schizophrenia versus bipolar disorder? Would that be accurate? It's a good question, because the certification guidelines or the ideas itself, which you'll discuss next time, so I don't want to go too much into details about it because you will discuss it. The ideas doesn't restrict itself to any one particular diagnosis in terms of mental illness. So it's not that there are some diagnoses which can cause disability. The understanding is that almost all psychiatric illnesses can cause disability. So it is based on your evaluation with the IDEA score, and somebody would have to cross what we call benchmark disability. So you should keep in mind that a person with disability would be somebody who has suffered psychosis at any one point of time. If it have long-term effects from it, would be a person with disability. If it arises beyond 40%, then they would be classified as a person with benchmark disability. So all welfare schemes apply to people who are persons with benchmark disability. This particular 40%, why not 50, why not 35? This is actually different in different countries. So for example, in certain higher income countries, this limit is actually higher. And this limit is set by a government in order to strike a balance between covering the people who need this the most, as well as providing an adequate sum of money based on the government's resources to each person. Keep in mind that welfare benefits are not only in terms of a pension or in a scheme like that. They also include things like service delivery. They also include things like stigma and awareness, or programs aimed at reducing stigma and raising awareness, increasing access. Schemes like, say, to some extent, Jan Aushadhi and other schemes which make medications cheaper to access or cheaper to buy. These are schemes which are all meant to aid somebody with disability and others as well. But when you look at government given social welfare benefits, they apply particularly to people with benchmark disability. So if your IDEA score rates the person as having higher than benchmark disability, and you can rate permanent disability or disability for a period of time, then this person becomes eligible for social welfare benefits. Keep in mind that certain welfare benefits, such as, say, for example, a family pension scheme, not only require you to have benchmark disability, you must be certified as not being able to earn an income, and you must be basically you have to show that you have no other means of supporting yourself for earning an income. That is when you actually become eligible for. So there are other provisions that kick in. One thing that I think you should think about a lot is about, especially somebody with a pension scheme, the pension rules as they stand right now indicate that there must be a nominee or a guardian to help this person access their scheme. And there have been cases, there's a PIL going on in court right now as well, about somebody who actually did not receive their pension because their caregiver has passed away and they don't have a guardian. So I think you should keep this in mind when you're educating family members and persons with disability. And this is something you should think about earlier rather than later, if such a measure makes sense to somebody, with that important caveat in mind.
Dr. Gaurav, we have unmuted your mic. Can you please ask your question?
But I am a member of what we call a motor accident court tribunal.
Yeah.
And in that we have two types of cases. Definitely many of them do not meet the 40% criteria. But then we have people who have motor accidents and subsequently develop cognitive impairment.
Mm.
And how can you convert that into a percentage of disability?
Right.
And secondly, what we are having is definitely some, like
Right.
after the motor accident, developing mood disorders and subsequently. So that obviously we can take according to the usual procedure. But the first part is a problem. How do we do that?
Yeah. See, look, that's a good question. When you look at how that is done, or rather how you must look at what certification guidelines allow you to do. Now, neuropsych is not a part of any guideline. And that is an important thing to keep in mind to assess severity of disability. So if in your case, suppose the case that you mentioned is somebody developed cognitive deficits, they would still at least come under a psychiatric diagnosis. because it would be post traumatic brain injury and sequelae. They may have other effects as well, including mood changes. They may have personality changes. So this diagnosis would actually enable them to be evaluated through IDEAS. So you can look at an IDEA score. You can, if the person has motor disability as well, that can also be evaluated separately in the way that it is mentioned in the guideline. And those two scores could be combined to give the person a score under the multiple disability criteria. So that would be the best avenue. Another similar instance is in dementia, where again the IDEA score is used despite the person having a primarily memory related issue. You would look at the IDEA score. Another thing that you should keep in mind is that for those with intellectual disability, the IQ score is not the indicator of severity of disability. What the Act specifies, or what the guidelines specify, is that the VSMS, the Vineland Social Maturity Scale, is the scale that should be used to assess severity of disability when it comes to intellectual disability. So that's why I said you should read the certification guidelines once, because they contain many things like this which are important to keep in mind.
Sir, in the
Does that answer your
certification, so in the certification guidelines, they mention under mental illness that you can, if the person with mental illness is also having IQ, like intellectual impairment, as
Yes.
you mentioned, take the higher score. So
Yeah.
the procedure that the people used to follow here was go for an IQ assessment and use the IQ score to convert it into a disability percentage.
Yeah, I mean, there are many ways people get around, or work around this problem. But what I would say is that since the way that the Act is developed has defined IQ as a disorder of development, it won't really come under this. What would this come under would be a dementia. This would be if somebody has suffered a cognitive problems as a result of their traumatic brain injury. This is a cause of a static dementia. Okay, so this would be, as I said, you don't need to actually even do a neuropsych. You can do an IDEAS and actually rate this person's disability.
Thank you, sir.
Right. Please keep in mind that many of these patients may be eligible for multiple disability as well. And if they become eligible for multiple disability, the provisions of the National Trust Act also apply to them, including the Niramaya Health Scheme. And the Niramaya Health Scheme has no age limit, as it states in the website, and it has no pre-tests or pre-diagnostic tests which are required. So if somebody does come under the scheme, they do come under multiple disability, please keep in mind the National Trust Act schemes as well. Thank you.
If there are no more questions, we thank Dr. Deepak for taking this class. And the next session we'll be announcing sooner. Next will be on forensic psychiatry. Next Saturday would be on forensic psychiatry. Before we end the program, there is an announcement from our side. On December 1st of this year, we have CMA on Community Child and Adolescent Mental Health, which is jointly organized by Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, Community Unit of Department of Psychiatry at NIMHANS, and also Child Psychiatry Specialty Division at Indian Psychiatric Society. So you're all welcome to register to this program and attend in great numbers. We would also like to thank Linux Laboratories for their support through an educational grant, due to which we are running this program.